My guest today is David Moskowitz. He is an award-winning photographer and wildlife biologist whose new book, Big River, Resilience and Renewal in the Columbia Basin, is full of hard-won, beautiful landscape shots, charismatic wildlife, and indigenous perspectives. We discussed his professional journey, documentarian ethics, wildlife photography techniques and technology like drones and camera traps, his conservation work with wolverines, salmon hatcheries, and the elusive kangaroo rat. We spoke in July 2024. You mentioned a storm drain near your house was your earliest memory of the wilderness. And I actually had something similar. We had like a storm drain behind the house with tadpoles and snakes that we would collect. And I'm curious, when you think back on that, what do you think it was that drew you into that environment as a kid?
I mean, a sense of adventure, like exploring something novel. Yeah, I think as a young person, like many young people, I was always kind of interested in things that weren't exactly where you were supposed to be, or like I wanted to try to find the secret way through the backyards of the neighbor's house to get out to the road, or just stuff like that. Just the places that aren't normal way to see the world.
Did you like meet the neighbor kids back there?
Oh yeah, I had a couple of friends in the neighborhood that we'd go off and explore. Mike and Mike.
Oh,
And
nice.
yeah, absolutely. And we'd, on bikes and we'd ditch our bikes and go explore along the river, what have you, or yep.
I haven't talked to a ton of wildlife photographers or anything, but some of the ones I've talked to, when I ask them kind of about hunting, it sounds like kind of early on they were more drawn to capturing photos than maybe hunting and fishing. I'm curious if that is true for you.
I grew up in a family with no outdoors, no relationship with the outdoors really in any capacity. My mom's family is all from New York City. I'm the third generation on this continent. Her family all got off the boat at Ellis Island and never made it out of New York City. And then my dad's family is kind of a similar story in San Francisco. So I was learning everything about the outdoors from scratch, not without any kind of cultural reference point. And I would say honestly, for me, I've always been an all of the above kind of approach to outdoor pursuits. And so I'm a hunter. I do some fishing, not as much as I used to, just with my schedule as crazy as it is, and because my occupation now involves trying to find wildlife. A week off where I go and try to find more wildlife doesn't necessarily feel like a vacation. So, but I still do, I'll go out and do a little deer hunting every few years. And so, yeah, I like it all. I just like being in relationship with wildlife. I think that for me is, and when you're photographing wildlife or hunting them or camera trapping them, especially, or studying them for research, you're in a relationship with them, where sometimes it's very practical, where it's like, the animals' choices affect your choices, or your choices affect the animals. So there's like really a give and take there. But just studying wildlife, you have a chance to, they just affect you. You learn about them, and that you're having a practical way of interacting with them. And in the modern world, there's so many people that don't have that chance. And it is such a, I would say, intrinsic part of what it means to be human, to be in relationship with other animals on the landscape. That's just, I feel very lucky to have that opportunity in my life, and lucky to have the chance to share some of that inspiration with other people through photography.
As a photographer, what is it that you like about still photos compared to capturing video?
Yeah, I'm definitely a photographer by choice and do videography work by necessity in the modern world. So you're spot on about that. I like how photos, in a photo you're trying to tell an entire story in one frame. And so it's very challenging in that way, but it's also very rewarding to figure out what are all the components of the story and how do I blend those together? What is the image that's going to tell this story? And so I enjoy that challenge, and yeah, I enjoy the aesthetics of them. I think those are the two main things.
Yeah. And the photographs in your book, Big River, are beautiful. I love the wildlife, but also just the geology and kind of seeing places that seem to be pretty hard to get to for some of them. I'm curious if you had a photo that ended up in the book that was like the most physically demanding to capture?
Yeah. So that would probably be the photos of the Columbia ice field. I believe that's the opening photo for the headwaters section of the book, and there's a few other images of Columbia ice field, but I write about that in the introduction. Me and my buddy Jeff Rose went up there to try to make these images. He was helping me carry some camera equipment, and we were either going to go in on skis or on foot, and we got to the base of where we were going to hike in, and we could just see miles of dirt and dry glacier where we couldn't use our skis. So we're going on foot. But then as soon as we got up on the ice field proper, we were post holing through knee deep, horrible snow. It's like, wish we had our skis. So that was, I was carrying, a drone up there and other camera equipment and overnight stuff, glacier travel stuff. So that was a really fun trip, but arduous, but it really paid off in terms of I think those images are really such a unique part of the watershed. It's such an archetypal image of what headwaters look like, and just to me, very captivating. So I was really glad I did that. The second option I would choose, but no photos made it into the book from this, I did a 63-mile round trip trail run to the headwaters of the Snake River. And we got stuck in a massive lightning and rainstorm right at when we got there to the headwaters, and just we went into survival mode to avoid getting hypothermia, and wasn't able to set up and take the photos I wanted, but it was a great adventure.
Damn. So is that the one that was the largest roadless area in the lower 48?
Correct.
Yeah, okay. So it's like there was no help probably to be even had if something did go sideways.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, we were out there. It's like the southeastern corner of Yellowstone National Park.
That's
Most people don't think about Yellowstone being in the Columbia River watershed, but parts of it are, which is pretty amazing.
This is kind of asking you to speculate a little bit, but how long do you reckon humans have been in North America?
Oh man, I am not an expert on that, but what I will say is that you'll get, depending on who you ask and what frame of reference you choose to use for answering that question, you'll get different answers. So, if you talk to archaeologists and anthropologists, Western scientists, they'll give you numbers, in the I think 20 to 25,000 years range based on scientific evidence. But if you talk to indigenous peoples, they'll say we've been here forever. Mm-hmm. And one of my jobs as a documentarian is to try to tell stories from the frame of reference of the people that I'm telling stories about. And so for the people that have been here since the beginning of time, that's how long they've been here. And for the folks that are telling the story of the geological history of the Columbia River watershed, the first evidence of when people show up on this landscape is, however many tens of thousands of years ago.
And what sort of challenges did you face trying to get indigenous peoples to open up and tell their story? Did you find that process to be about what you expected, or were people maybe reluctant to share with your project?
I would take a step back from that and say everybody that I photographed for this project, whether they were indigenous or members of the settler colonial culture, can start off wary when you approach them with a camera and saying, I want to take pictures of you for a project, because they're like, why do you want to do that? And what are you going to use it for? And what's your reference? And obviously indigenous peoples have a long history of having their culture misappropriated. And so there's a special sensitivity there. But even I was photographing commercial fishermen, and commercial fishermen on the Columbia River are definitely looked down upon by other segments of society. So they were a little bit wary, or you're going to make us out to be bad guys, or lock operators that are running, working at the dams, same kind of issues. And so for me as a photographer and a documentarian working to tell the stories of people, I always approach that trying to just understand, I try to communicate to them that my goal is to understand their perspective and to create images that present their perspective in a way that feels genuine and authentic. And, the quotes I got from folks that we use, those all go back to them to review to make sure that I'm not interested in catching weird sound bites that like fit my narrative, but don't really reflect the actual ideas of the people that I'm covering in stories. I want it to actually reflect. It's like if what you said, in that moment doesn't exactly say what you actually mean, then edit it. Give me what you actually mean. What do you actually think about the Columbia River? That's what I want. I'm not trying to catch you or trap you. I'm trying to provide a window into your frame of reference for this watershed.
Mm-hmm.
And that seems to help when people realize that I'm genuinely curious about their perspective. I think that really opens up doors to being willing to share. And because people do, it's like, especially for things that are important to them, having the opportunity to share their perspective in a way that might affect other people is valuable to folks as well. And I saw that in indigenous and non-indigenous communities, that when they felt safe, like they had a non-biased platform, that they would be willing to open up and share.
Hmm. And that was mostly born by just like personal conversations, or were you able to, or did you have to rely on, connections to people they already knew?
All of the above, so I met folks, like Lou George, who I photographed and who's in the front of the book, who's a fisherman by the Dalles Dam, Yakima man. I just went out to an area where I saw, folks fishing and started chatting him up. And it took me over 2 years of visiting with him before he let me take his picture.
Oh, wow.
I'm gonna just go take pictures of people without, their consent. Again, it's the same thing. And, so that was through kind of developing a relationship, and which is really valuable to me. I learned a ton about the river and his perspective on it. And by the time I was making portraits of him, it felt like a really natural part of the relationship we developed. Other folks, much quicker, and certainly, yeah, like points of contact, being introduced to somebody through somebody else is really helpful. The ranchers out in the Owyhee area that I photographed came from a mutual colleague, that they had worked with, that I had worked with, who introduced us. And that really opened the doors to them inviting me into their, literally their home and their ranch to photograph them and their activities. So those personal relationships or connections are obviously really helpful too, when you don't have 2 years to make a photo.
Right. Yeah, good 20-year book project.
Exactly.
So if you could change something about the management of the Columbia River Basin with, a magic wand, what's the top thing on your list of what you would do?
It's a good question. I think it would be to have the value of ecosystem services taken into account consistently and clearly. A lot of times management decisions on this river, and a lot of times our resource management decisions in our society in general, do a lot of externalizing. I don't know if you're familiar with the term from like economics, but it's like if we can externalize this cost, we don't have to consider it in our accounting, then, if we can get the taxpayers to pay for this road to be built and we don't have to pay for it, then this resource extraction activity becomes profitable. But if we have to pay for it, then it doesn't. And we have a lot of resource use on the Columbia River right now that it only makes sense economically because we are externalizing the costs of those activities. So how we manage water, the impacts on our ecosystems, the impacts on salmon, we're not taking into account the cost that our activities are generating for us in terms of going back and, we destroy a watershed like the floodplain, and then we need to provide flood control, right? It's a cost. But we also aren't really taking into account the benefits we get there either. So how this watershed naturally, sequesters carbon or stores water naturally, right? You build a reservoir and it stores water, and you have winter snowpack, it also stores water, or you have a forest that stores water inside of it. So we don't do a good job of accounting for the way ecosystem services are of economic value. And so when we're talking about management of the river, I think if we did that, we would have a very different management scheme than the one we're currently using for the river.
Why did past generations understand so little or care so little about damaging the river resource? Do you think that was driven more by greed or ignorance?
So when you say past generations, you mean past generations of settlers in the Columbia River watershed, just to distinguish past generations of indigenous people, because the question you're asking seems to be implying that. Because I would go back and start with my answer being like, there was a clear model of living on this landscape in a way that did tend to the resources of it. And salmon is a great example. Like the indigenous people on this landscape had very specific intertribal protocols for managing their own fisheries in a way that allowed fish to pass upstream for reproduction, but also allowed fish to travel up the river for other tribes to access that food. And so there was a very carefully choreographed economic model that tended to ecological health and economic well-being for multiple different users on the river. So into that, settler colonial European American culture came, and they set up a totally different model that was extremely extractive, that didn't take those things into consideration. And when you ask why did people do that, I mean, certainly we understand the consequences of our choices better now than we did then, and in more granularity. But to say that we did that out of ignorance, I'd say is to give our society a pass that they don't deserve, because there was a model there of how to do this well, which we belittled and discounted. And I would say more, we have an issue of the tragedy of the commons. So salmon and water were considered so abundant and kind of readily accessible to anybody that could get their hands on it, that you have a classic example of a race to the bottom where everybody's taking as much as they can before somebody else gets it. So that's part of it. Having a economic model that's driven on, capitalism, that's driven on resource extraction to create wealth for people outside of the region where the resource extraction is being done, is an issue that is as alive today as it was in the settling of this landscape. We basically mined fish from this river. And so I think that's another issue, is just the economic model we have doesn't lend itself to sustainable use.
So would you say beaver dams are an obstacle to migrating salmon similar to human-built dams, or totally different things?
Yeah, absolutely not. I do believe the longest beaver dam in the world was found up in Canada, and it was like 2.5 miles long, which is huge, but it's only a few feet tall. So, beaver dams definitely, I mean, while in one particular instance might provide a small obstacle in certain circumstances at certain water levels to fish, in general, the presence of beavers in the watershed actually makes a better landscape for fish by create down trees, create cover structure, beaver dams and sloughs create diverse features in a river or stream system, which different salmon need different features. So they do that. Beavers retain water in the ecosystem, and so it can flow out slowly. Again, it's another way to store water. And it stores it not just in the pond, but by raising the whole water table in an area. And that's, the more water in an area, the better it is for fish in general. So they're really totally incomparable structures on the landscape.
This edition of Ryan's Corner is sponsored by Mile High Life, the maker of my favorite dog leash. Their dual configuration leash has an adjustable clip on the handle end which can go around your waist if you're running, or made into a quick tether around a pole. The slip lead has a safety stopper that should be fitted to your dog to protect against over-tightening. If you're not familiar with how to train with a slip lead, please ask a vet or behaviorist, or send me an email and I'll walk you through it. Use promo code Ryan's Corner to get 15% off your order at milehighlife.us. If you could have it your way, do you think every hydroelectric dam should have a salmon ladder? Or is that inefficient, or is that not realistic?
I'd say that in the modern world, given what we know now, that any hydro dam on a fish-bearing stream should include passage for those fish in some capacity. Now, whether that's a fish ladder or there's all sorts of other new technology coming on, that comes back to that original point of understanding that rivers do more than provide hydropower or irrigation, that they provide ecological function. And in some ways, the ability for fish, whether they're anadromous or non-anadromous, to continue to travel the river corridor freely is a sign of whether or not we have preserved the ecological function of that river. And we can assume that along with having fish, we're also going to have other benefits, ecological service benefits from allowing that connectivity in the river.
And you mentioned in your book that potentially relying on hatcheries may be like a bit of a trap of a strategy. I'm curious, would you prefer to see more or fewer hatcheries relied on as a conservation strategy?
I think our approach in the book, and this is a really better question for my colleague, Eileen, who wrote the primary essay for it, because she's super well versed in this. But I think it's safe and fair to say that both of us recognize that hatcheries in the past have been used to try to replace wild salmon stocks or make up for the destruction of their habitat. And that has, by and large, not worked. Like we have decades of trying to use hatcheries to just replace wild fish, and we have less fish than we ever have. So clearly something's wrong with that model. That being said, the way we are using hatcheries today is different than how we used them 80 years ago. And there is a role today in hatcheries continuing to help provide subsistence fishing opportunities for indigenous people, which is their right to have. And without some of the hatcheries we have, their opportunities to feed themselves their traditional food would be even worse than they are now, and they're not good. And so I think recognizing that while we move towards some ideal future where maybe we were less reliant on hatcheries, getting rid of them today would not necessarily just fix our problems. And then the other thing I'd say is that we are learning to use hatcheries in a way to help, in some instances, to help recovery of wild salmon stocks. So they're not a replacement for, but given our current conservation dilemmas, they can be used to the service of greater recovery for salmon in the wild. They're not always done that way. There's the good, the bad, and the ugly with that stuff, but like most conservation stories, it's complicated.
Okay. Right. So on some level, it's a lifeline and it's helping, but I think maybe in the book it was mentioned maybe like they're not helpful for genetic diversity, or the fact that
they can be real problems for genetic diversity, or they can help with that. So if you use if you take salmon genetics from the place you're trying to recover fish, make more of them in a hatchery, release them, and then get them back flowing to habitat where they didn't used to have access to, that could be a net win. But if you're totally swamping a very small wild stock of salmon with thousands and thousands of genetically dissimilar salmon that are then competing with the wild fish for food and such, then yeah, you're creating a big problem. So like I said, it's like the devil's in the details.
From what I was reading, it sounds like back in the day, or maybe like the mid 20th century, they tried to introduce Atlantic salmon into the Pacific, and that it never really worked. I'm curious, did you investigate that attempt at all, or like never?
I'm not familiar with that. We do have a number of invasive fish in the Columbia, but I'm not familiar with any substantial populations of Atlantic salmon that we've got.
Maybe
Shad, SHAD.
I don't think it ever worked. I think they tried several times because they got bigger. The idea was they wanted the bigger fish.
My project focused on the contemporary Columbia River. I really shied away from like telling stories about what we lost, but there used to be 100-pound salmon in the Columbia River. So I don't think we're going to make bigger fish than that.
Big.
All creatures that weighed 100. I mean, it's like, yeah, I've never seen an Atlantic salmon that big.
That's crazy. 100-pound salmon going up that. You had a great photo of a lamprey eel.
Yeah.
Those are such weird looking animals. Did you get, and you also mentioned that that's an indigenous food source. I was curious if you ever got a chance to taste one.
No, I didn't. I would definitely, if I had the opportunity in an ethical way, I would be delighted to taste lamprey. From what I heard, talking to like Lou George and a couple other folks, it's quite tasty. It's pretty oily fish, but people like it.
Another photography question. So what are the most important advances in technology or equipment that have changed the way you do your work? And like when you think about lightweight gear versus performance
Yeah.
capabilities and batteries and thermal stuff, are you a guy who likes to try out new stuff?
Gosh, the world of photography has changed so much because of changes in equipment. I mean, like the photos, some of the aerial photos I took in the book are from a plane, but many of them are from a drone. So that's a new technology that, has really helped take pictures that I just wouldn't have been able to get access to as efficiently, at least. Underwater equipment, is great. As far as like I shoot all mirrorless now. And so for wildlife photography, having a camera that's totally silent when it takes pictures allows for more intimate wildlife encounters.
I never thought about that. Yeah. So that silent shutter makes a big difference, I bet.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Not for some animals and not in all conditions, but in many, it's really big difference. And lightweight equipment. When I went to the headwaters of the Snake River, like I took this camera, it's like this shoots raw images that, I've published in magazines and stuff. So I certainly don't take most of my images with a camera that size, but yeah, I've really, the modern, it's interesting. Somebody once told me that, that the more money you spend on your camera equipment, the better the photos you can take. And that's not exactly true, but like you still need the skill to know how to use it, obviously. But there are so many new possibilities and so much new and different types of equipment that really liberates photographers' creativity in a way that the old school 32 frames, big camera, like slow shutters, like no autofocus, like it's night and day between what we can do now and what we were able to do in the past. And you can't let your equipment replace your creativity. But if you imagine an image, then you can probably dig up the equipment to figure out how to make it. Like the photos of the mountain lion in the book, which is lit with 3 strobes, and the animal took its own photograph with a motion sensor, right? But I set it up where I knew the animal was going to go. So that's a totally created image that relied on, radio triggers for the flashes and like a lot of technology to produce an image that I had in my mind that tells the story of that animal in a way that looks natural, right? Like it's like it looked like you have an image, a window into this animal's life. And that is thanks to both a mix of kind of, I'd like to say a little bit of skill and a lot of imagination and then, the right equipment.
Wow. So anybody who's trying to step up their camera trap game, you got to get some other lights involved. You have coordinated lighting, it sounds like, with your camera trap.
Yeah. Yeah. You can't do that for every species. Canines are completely, very wary of anything human. And if you flash them, they're gone. But cats are super chill. You can flash them day and night. And so you can really create some interesting images. And then the other thing I think about with all my photography, the ethics is like, I want to make sure that how I'm taking images isn't in the same way that I don't want my images to hurt people by misrepresenting them. I don't want my images to hurt wildlife, and that could be by displacing them, by scaring them. And so I really try to fit the style of photography I'm doing for wildlife both what the animal will tolerate, but what's appropriate from a conservation perspective as well.
The wolf photo, I thought the wolf photo was probably the funniest photo in the book. His expression was very funny.
And that camera was set for a lynx, and I got a wolf instead. And that's a great example. I got 3 photos of the wolf. I got a photo where the first one goes off, and then there's the next one of it looking startled, and the third one is it's gone. Whereas with mountains, they're just like, they'll get flashed again and again. They don't flinch at all. It's like super chill.
Is that, you think that, like, would you call that confidence? Would you think the mountain lion's more confident than a wolf?
No, I think it has to do with demeanor and like demeanor of different types of animals in general. And they just approach the world in a different way. Plus, with
Maybe.
wolves and people have a long, long antagonistic history, and
Hmm.
wolves are quite smart. So, in some ways, actually, a wolf's concern about weird human objects in the wilderness probably represents a level of learning and intelligence that is quite exceptional.
Interesting. So maybe the mountain lion's not quite sure what's happening, whereas the wolf's like, this is a bad sign.
Yeah, or evolutionarily, they just haven't seen the need to um, react as cautiously to novel things in the environment.
What's like a non-camera skill that amateur photographers could work on?
Non-camera, so you mean like composition or things like that, or you mean like navigation to get to the places you're going? Like what?
I guess I was trying to think kind of when you're out in the wilderness and you're kind of planning a day, you're trying to think about the animal behaviors, where to be to get a good shot. And, a lot of photography is happening behind the camera, but I'm just kind of curious what occupies your mind. What's like a thing you have to be really good at to do what you do that isn't necessarily working the camera?
Yeah, well, in some senses, actually, you want your ability to use your camera to become almost second nature, so that your attention can be focused elsewhere. I mean, landscape photography, you can set up and take your time. I'll get there 3 hours before the light changes and get everything all arranged. It's really nice. But for people and action and wildlife, it's like things are changing quickly, and you need to be able to, have your attention focused on that. So, in some ways, being able to use your camera is just like the entry fee to actually taking good photos. If you can't do that, you can't even get in the door. But once you're in the door, if you're going to do it well, you're going to need to, for wildlife, you need to understand their biology. Like most good wildlife photos are made by people that are anticipating what that animal is going to do, right? They're like, okay, I'm setting up because I think this is going to be where these bull elk are going to spar, right? And this is the time of year they do it. So that's why I came here. So there's like all this natural history knowledge and behavior and understanding what the actual actions of the animals are going to be, so that you know where to set up to catch that. Same thing with people, right? When I'm photographing like fishermen on a boat, I need to watch them fish for a while and then figure out how they move so I know how to insert myself into that situation. So a lot of it is really setting up your shots, and how you set up your shot really requires a lot of homework on the subject that you're doing. I mean, and that can be in the moment, like I get on a fishing boat and I watch them for 15 minutes before I start taking pictures just to see how they move, and then I set up my lighting and whatever and go to town. Or it could be years. Like I go to an area and like I'm like, okay, there's elk in this area, and it looks like, this is an area they spend time in the fall, but it's May. So I guess I'll come back in the fall, right? And then I also know that like, oh, this is a area where there's a lot of scent marking, and like they're going to be using this area, and like this is a spot where I could probably shoot this from a blind, so I know I'm going to have to bring a blind back with me, and like I'll probably need a this length lens, So then the first trip is really like I didn't take a single photo. It's just doing the research for what I'm going to need to make the images that, what are the opportunities that are going to present themselves.
Yeah, sounds like a lot of behavior study too on the part of the animals in particular.
Absolutely.
I'm curious, like, what would you say was the most mysterious animal you photographed?
I mean, the two that come to mind are the wolverine, which I love wolverines, and I've been studying them for 5 years here or 6 years now in the North Cascades. And I've still never seen one with my own eyes.
Oh wow.
So that qualifies as mysterious. But then the other one was the kangaroo rats. So there's a photo of a kangaroo rat, lives out in the desert along the Columbia, and these guys come out only at night. They are super adapted to the desert. They never have to drink water their whole lives. They metabolize all their water out of the food that they eat.
Oh
And
wow.
it's just like they're crazy little critters that hop around on their hind two legs. It's like a critter that you like Dr. Seuss would imagine, would create this animal.
Hmm.
So
Yeah, and the photograph you did include made it look like it would be hard to get their photograph because he was coming out of his hole, but he was in motion. Are they just always on the move?
Exactly.
Yeah, that's wild that they never drink water. Were there any animals on your wish list that you ultimately had to abandon, or one that took way more work than you expected?
I was hoping to include a photo of a coyote along the Columbia River, because coyotes are a culturally important species on a lot of levels. And I set up some camera traps for them, and I visited areas. I saw coyotes like close to the river, but the shot never really lined itself up. And a number of the places I was hoping to camera trap for them, which is already like to camera trap for a coyote, like a wolf, is like pretty tall task to actually get anything good.
Mm-hmm.
But I just couldn't find the right lineup and just had to let that one go.
Yeah, what's so tough about it? Are they more unpredictable in their movements?
Well, one of it, I could have put more time and energy into it. Like I'm sure if I said, okay, I'm going to give myself the next 3 months and all I'm going to do is get this perfect coyote photo along the river, I could probably do it. But, just weighing a huge project and like how much time can I put into it was part of it. So you could translate that to my own laziness. But they are pretty wary animals of people. They occupy open landscapes, so it's hard to necessarily approach them.
You mean physically, like you see one and you want to go get a photograph? Just that movement is
exactly. Yeah. And then as far as setting camera traps, if you're trying to leave a camera out in a place where, for a month or two, I try to lock them to something. And so if you live in a grassland, it's like just not a spot I'm going to leave, $3,000 of camera equipment. So that was another challenge I ran into with them.
So I was curious, have you ever had any success photographing bats or owls? Those I was trying to rack my brain for what would be like super hard to photograph. And
I have some amazing night bat photography with like high speed strobes and like fascinating stuff. I've never endeavored to do that. And all of the owls I've photographed, well, I've shot some owls in low light, either with natural ambient light or with like a flash extender. So you can shoot, use a long lens, and a flash on the camera to light up the animal, but never done that at night. It's all been, dawn or dusk type stuff.
All right, so here's another asking you to speculate a little bit. When you think about animal activity that occurs at daytime and nighttime, do you reckon that it's about the same? Maybe if you measured it in terms of metabolic expenditure or biomass that is active, do you think night and day are roughly equivalent, or do you think there's way more activity in the daytime generally?
Well, it depends on the species and it depends on the time of year. There's a lot of research that shows for any particular species, like in a northern cold environment, you might see them more active at night during the summer when it's hot during the day, and more active during the day in the winter when it's really cold at night. And then you'll see some species that when they're close to humans, they'll be more nocturnal, but when there's no people around, they'll be more diurnal. And then there are some animals like squirrels, like flying squirrels come out only at night, but all the rest of the tree squirrels come out only during the day. So they're just obligate daytime or nighttime creatures. Bats being another good example of that. They're almost always out at night. So it really depends on a lot of things.
Are wolverines one of those that are sensitive to human presence, and do they change their behavior?
Yeah, wolverines definitely are sensitive to human presence, typically avoidant of it, occasionally attracted to it in odd ways, but mostly avoidant to it.
Could you tell us about the Cascade Wolverine project? Like, what's the mission for that, and what's your involvement?
Sure. Well, I'm one of the co-founders of Cascades Wolverine Project with Steph Williams, who's a friend and colleague, a mountain guide and biologist. And we started that project to keep track of wolverines in our region and like our watershed and the surrounding mountains here. And so first off, to just figure out where wolverines were and whatever we can learn about them beyond just their existence here. And then secondarily was to engage the broader community in wolverine conservation and conservation of mountain ecosystems. So they're a bit of a flagship species, and you can get people excited about wolverines, and that can engage them in broader conservation. But then also because we do have predicted growing negative impacts for wolverines, both through climate change, but then also through increasing recreational use. We wanted to engage the recreational public in awareness and conservation of the species, to have folks that are recreating in wolverine habitat be champions of wolverines rather than detractors of them, because they're worried that presence of wolverines might impact their recreational options negatively.
They seem like such a cool animal. I love wolverines. I think like they're just out there getting by on attitude, and
Absolutely.
maybe pound for pound the bravest animal, would you say?
They're pretty feisty. They're absolutely. Yep. I mean, they're I think their willingness to and ability to fend off larger carnivores is a little bit overstated. Like, still generally fall under the rule that the bigger predator turns out better in any altercation, but they do have tenacity, and they're not afraid to, if they're backed into a corner, they'll stand up to a person or a bear or, wolves that are much bigger than them. So yeah, they're a tenacious critter.
And are they mostly solitary? Do they have any social behaviors?
Yeah, so they are considered a solitary animal, but from a wildlife biology perspective, in that on the whole, they don't live in extended family groups over many years or generations. They're not colonial. So it's typically an individual animal with a home range, and males exclude other males from that home range, and females do the same. But we are learning that their social world is more complicated than that, that males will come and visit their kids every once in a while.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, you'll find, so there are relationships between wolverines that are more than just avoiding each other most of the year and then finding males and females finding each other for reproduction. And other than that, they never interact, aside from the females raising the young until the young are old enough to leave. It's more complicated than that.
Oh, wow. So is there maybe some evidence of like sharing resources, or more like they just kind of tolerate being in the same hunting area?
I believe there's some evidence now of resource sharing. Not much. It's not like African lions. It's not like wolves. It's nothing close to that. But it's also not every wolverine for themselves.
Very interesting. So, what's a place that you're interested in returning to? Is there something from a place you visited in the book that you'd be eager to get back to?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, I was just out on a mountaineering trip in the headwaters of the Columbia River. I was excited to get back there, and excited to get back there without a shot list of photos I needed to take, but just to be able to enjoy myself.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't think I'm anywhere close to done exploring the mountains that make up the Columbia River watershed. I'd still like to raft Hell's Canyon. I never had a chance to do that on the Snake, and I'd like to raft the Salmon River as well in Idaho.
Who's a figure early in your career who inspired your imagination that you could do this professionally and be good at it?
Well, my first mentor with photography was my uncle. He was an amateur photographer, but he got me started in his darkroom, and that got me kind of going on the bug for taking pictures. And then
and was that in New York?
He lived in Maryland, but that's my mom's family. My mom's family is all from the East Coast. But and then my mom published a book, so that kind of gave me the idea that maybe I could publish a book. My grandfather published a book, so the book making thing was in the family, although their books were very different than mine. My grandfather's book was a handbook it was called Longitudinal Statistical Analysis.
Oh, wow.
Statistics professor at Hofstra. And then my mom's book was a handbook for medical professionals and mothers to breastfeeding. She's a pediatrician.
Oh, wow.
So the content was nothing similar to what I'm working on, but I guess a little family history there as far as tackling, book projects.
I'm curious, when salmon are spawning, why is it that they start to look like goblins? Like, how is that appearance related to something functional?
Yeah. Um, I'm not sure about the function of the visual changes, the way they look. But when salmon enter freshwater on their way to anadromous salmon enter freshwater on their way to spawn, most species are going to die, right? They don't return to the saltwater. It's a one-way trip, and they stop eating when they enter freshwater. They're living off the fat that they've stored in their bodies, and then they actually start digesting some of their own internal organs to create energy to continue that journey. So they're literally, their body becomes a reservoir of energy to complete their final task, which is make it upstream to spawn, protect your eggs as long as you can, and then die. And then your body actually disintegrates, and the nutrients from that feed your young. So that process of changing how they appear, I'm sure, is part of the physiological, shutdown of some of their systems and just digesting their own body to make that trip.
Okay, so maybe it's more of a deterioration thing than that they grow like a big nose to swim
Yeah,
through.
it might be. That's a question. It's a great question, which I've never asked, but I'm sure fisheries biologists have studied that, and there may be some function to the hooked nose on especially males, because that happens in males more than females. So it could be part of their aggressive behavior. You'll see a lot of aggressive behavior between males around spawning areas where they're trying to, they're vying for the opportunity to fertilize eggs. So because it is only in males and not, or more in males than females, I would hypothesize that there's something having to do with access to reproduction.
All right. If you had a time machine, where and when where would you go? And maybe if you had the goal of capturing like a great photograph.
Oh my God. Are we talking about going backwards or forwards?
Hey, you can go forwards.
I mean, there's lots of ways that the stories I've heard about how this river system looked pre-colonization. Like, I would love to go back and be able to see Kettle Falls and Celilo Falls and see 100-pound fish, and or go back even further and see woolly mammoths roaming around in eastern Washington along the banks of the river. So I definitely have a fascination with the stories I've heard about what was here in the past, and obviously that would be fascinating to see. But I honestly try to stay pretty grounded in the present, and it's kind of part of my philosophy around the work I do. And as somebody interested in conservation and environmental justice, I really try to focus on the things that I can do and do those things, and recognize that the issues we face in the 21st century are so huge. And I'm not going to personally be able to make huge changes on every front. So I just need to do the work I can do, and trust that everyone else will do their share. And with that, we'll find our destiny. So yeah, just try to stay in the now.
Good. Yeah. That's good. Well, we're glad to have you here in the now. So
Very
that's great. All right. So not to get political or anything, but if you were submitting a question to a presidential debate, what's a question you'd like to ask the guys?
Yeah, I mean, it would be something about going back to sort of the start of our interview, which is how would you propose that we better live within our finite resources and integrate ecological function and ecological services into our economic system and our social economy, our social interactions between each other.
And to that end, I think, books like yours do a great job of showing people what's out there that they maybe aren't familiar with. And once you know something, you tend to care about it. And so I really appreciate your book. I loved looking at the pictures and reading the story. David, thank you so much for your time today. It was really great talking to you.
Sounds good. Thanks a lot.
David Moskowitz's latest book is Big River, Resilience and Renewal in the Columbia Basin, and his previous books include Caribou Rainforest, Wildlife of the Pacific Northwest, Wolves in the Land of Salmon, and Peterson's Field Guide to North American Bird Nests. His website is davidmoskowitz.net. Thank you for listening.